Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision Podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Dr. John J. Collins, Professor Collins, thank you so much for joining me here at MythVision Podcast. I can't tell you, every time I'm reading a commentary or something, your name comes up, and it's like, well, if this guy's name keeps coming up, I think it's important that I talk to him about the Old Testament. Your wife also wrote a commentary or book, particularly on the book of Revelation, which is wonderful.
A couple of books on Revelation and a commentary on the Gospel of Mark.
So it runs in the family here, yeah. And it's really a pleasure to have you on MythVision. So first question I have, and these are people that are followers of MythVision, they really enjoy what you do, and they said, hey Derek, Aaron Geraldson, I hope it said that correct. Hey Derek, I have a question for Dr. Collins. Since you asked for a few, what can he tell us about the influence of intertestamental and apocryphal literature on both later Hellenistic Judaism as well as early Christianity? I feel like the impact of these texts is often underrated by many simply because they're not canonical. But just how influential were they really? Hopefully this isn't too broad of a question.
Yeah, it's easier maybe speak about how influential they were for early Christianity. But if you start with Judaism, the problem to a great degree is that literature that wasn't written in Hebrew and literature that didn't survive in Hebrew in its early stages tended not to be preserved at all in Judaism. And so it was a huge literature in Alexandria, in Greek. Philo of Alexandria, one of the major Jewish thinkers ever. But if it hadn't been for Christians, we wouldn't even know about him.
Wow.
Because the rabbis did not preserve literature in Greek. So, the effect or the influence of apocryphal, non-canonical literature in Judaism got kind of cut off. Now, that may be exaggerating a little bit because when I talk about canonical literature, the idea of a canon is a Christian idea. And it really only becomes effective about 400. Prior to that, you have collections of scriptures. They're always ill-defined to some degree. I compare it to the Oxford Book of English Verse. Now, if you are going to do an edition of an Oxford Book of English Verse, you will have Shakespeare's sonnets, you will have Milton, you'll have Keats and Shelley, but now of the more recent 20th, early 21st century material, will you have Ted Hughes? Will you have Sylvia Plath? These things might be open questions. So some things are very well established, some things much less. Now, there was a lot of literature in circulation in the last 200 years before the time of Christ. We know there was a lot of literature in Hebrew because we found it, or people found it, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Prior to that, we only had material in translation and occasional fragments, maybe a quotation here and there, like the Book of Ben Sira in the rabbis. But now some of that literature may have been quite influential at its time. Big controversy over the books of Enoch. The books of Enoch became canonical in Ethiopian Christianity. But we now have parts of most of them, not all, but most of them in Aramaic, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know they had some influence. Some people think they were very influential. Some people think this was a major strand of Judaism, that Enoch was comparable to Moses. I don't think it was quite that important, but that's not to say it wasn't important. So, there was, I think, a lot more variety in Judaism around the turn of the era than what survived later on. This becomes a somewhat sensitive question because there have always been people, many of them Jewish, but not all of them Jewish, who think that real Judaism is what the rabbis preserved and material like it. A lot of this non-canonical literature came to light in the 19th century. One of the big turning points in all of this was when a Scottish traveller brought back, it now seems like 4 copies of the Book of Enoch. This would have been in the late 18th century. He put one in the Bodleian at Oxford, he put one in Paris, he gave one to the Pope, apparently. Maybe there were 2 in the Bodleian, now I forget. But it's when those got published that there became a renewed interest in the West in this non-canonical material. Material that had been regarded by some people as sacred scripture. Then people started hunting around in libraries in the 19th century and kept finding more of this strange stuff. A lot of them are what we call apocalypses. A lot of them had visions of the other world, accounts of ascents to heaven, this kind of thing. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, a German scholar named Bousset wrote an account of the religion of Judaism that was largely based on that material. And this became enormously controversial. A rabbi wrote a rejoinder saying that this had just missed the heart of Judaism, that it was basing everything on peripheral material that wasn't important to anyone. And a great Christian scholar, George Foot Moore, one of the great scholars of ancient Judaism of his day, he taught at Harvard, he agreed with the rabbi. And he published his account of Judaism that was primarily based on the rabbis with occasional references to this other stuff. Now, that subsided for a while. There is something of the same debate at the present time of some people, who... Now, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see there you get 2 kinds of material, at least. You get a lot of this kind of apocalyptic, revelatory material, but then you also get a lot of legal material that's very much like what you get in the rabbis. And so the debate continues. How important was this other stuff? My own sense is that down through the first century of the Common Era, it was very important in Judaism. The Judaism at that point, was pretty diverse. Think of Christianity at the present time.
Right.
Christians are all over the map. Now, you will find certain things that kind of hold them together. And you will find certain things in Judaism that kind of held things together. But the differences could be enormous.
How influential would you say Enoch, right? 1 Enoch. How influential would you say that was for the Christians and New Testament? I mean, we obviously know later there's certain versions, like the Ethiopians, they saw it as canon, but like the text that we have, it seems like Enoch plays obviously in Jude there's the reference in Jude. I think there's a reference in the Gospel of Matthew. When the Son of Man will sit on his throne of glory. The only other place you get that is in the similitudes of Enoch. So I think, but the real influence of that material isn't so much in cases where you can say they definitely use that book here. It's in cases where you have this kind of thought, the kind of thing represented by the Book of Enoch becomes very typical of early Christianity. Now, again, I don't mean to deny that there's also variety in early Christianity. Right.
It wasn't necessarily all this way, but there's an awful lot of it that was. And then partly because that stuff became so popular among Christians, I think Jews backed away from it. And that's why books of Enoch, a lot of these apocalypses are only preserved by Christians. Now, that then becomes extremely controversial. Some of the stuff that Christians liked was stuff that rabbis and other Jewish leaders didn't like. You know, we've been involved in a little controversy. There's a text called 3rd Baruch. Now, this Apocalypse of 3rd Baruch survives only a few manuscripts. One of them is in Greek, one version of it, and the other is in Slavonic. Both texts that we have are very clearly Christian. But the thing is, the Christian parts in the two versions don't correspond at all. So when you find a passage in Greek Baruch that will talk about Christians and the blood of Christ and unmistakably Christian references, those don't show up in the Slavonic, and vice versa. Now, that raises the interesting question, and many of us think, therefore, that what you had here was a Jewish text, and that you have Christians who developed it in different ways. But it's hard to imagine that the Slavonic translator would leave out explicitly Christian material.
Right.
Now, on the other hand, Martha Himmelfarb, who teaches at Princeton, is adamantly, this is obviously Christian. Now, part of why it's obviously Christian to her is that at the beginning of it, Baruch is worrying over the destruction of Jerusalem. And an angel says to him, "Don't worry so much about the destruction of Jerusalem. Come and I will show you the mysteries of God." So the question becomes, could a Jew have written that?
Right.
Now, you see, I say a Jew could write anything. Just like a Christian can write anything.
That's a good point, because I think oftentimes we put them in a box of thinking that they're temple-centric, and some of these groups, like the Essenes, seem to not care about that, and especially diaspora Jewish communities.
And presumably after the destruction of the temple, it seems to me that what you have in that text is a Jewish writer who said, come on, let's get over it. Let's move on. But now Martha wouldn't have that at all. You know, something that is critical of Judaism as she understands it cannot be.
Wow.
So, you know, these are kind of loaded issues. Now, how typical they were of Christianity is maybe another question. They certainly were at home in Christianity for a long time, read as Christian texts. Now, you know, in the Book of Enoch, most of which now is found in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indisputably Jewish. But in Ethiopia, this is the Book of Enoch the prophet, and it's all taken to be prophesying Jesus.
Yeah, of course.
So
Well, that brings a good, interesting question I'd like to ask about the animal apocalypse. The animal, or maybe I should back up just a second to like phrase it this way. A lot of the literature that is like apocalyptic, if you will, if I could use the term, Second Temple Judaism type material, seems to have a very negative outlook about Katim, the Gentiles, the ethne. But there's sometimes you find the animal apocalypse where they all become the clean animal, or you see these Sibylline oracles, or like just Hellenized works. How did that work out? It seems like, I don't know, like Gentiles have a strange place in Christianity, obviously. They take over it eventually because there's an evolution taking place here, I think. But what would you say the influence of this ethnic, am I making sense here?
Yeah. You know, there are, in the Hebrew Bible already. Now, you know, you have some things like the Book of Ezra that will say, you know, it's an awful thing if Jews profane the holy seed by marrying foreigners. That's maybe the most extreme idea that you get in the Hebrew Bible on one end. Also, you have passages in Deuteronomy, when you go into the land, don't let any of them live, essentially. Now, they're not saying that about all Gentiles, but about the ones who are in your way. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have the book of Isaiah, and you have some of the Psalms that have a vision of the mountain of the Lord's house being lifted up, and all the nations flocking to Mount Zion. And the idea is that they will bring the wealth of the nations.
That's universal. That's obviously. And I guess that it goes, there's a tug of war there, but thank you so much for that.